It's embarrassing. I feel a little bit ashamed to be British in this one. This is not right. This is not right at all. Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. Oh, Danny's back. Danny, I feel like it's been a minute since I've read one of your scripts. Format of the show, if you're new here, I've never read this before, we're going to read it together, dear listener. Or viewer if you're watching on YouTube, in which case, hello. Hit that like button, and you subscribed. And if you're doing this as a podcast, why not leave a review? I love that. I love reading your reviews. That's a lie. It's been a long time since I read the reviews, but it reminds me that I should read the reviews. I'll go do that. I'm sure some will make me feel lovely, and some will make me feel like a horrible human being. Let's get into it. If 68-year-old Peter Sullivan from Birkenhead in the UK ever kept a diary, it would be fascinating to read his entry for the 13th of May 2025. Oh my god, this is extremely recently. It's like 2 months ago. That was the day a man known as the Beast of Birkenhead, the Mersey Ripper, and the Wolfman, how have I not heard of this, was released from prison after being found guilty of the horrific sexual assault and murder of 21-year-old Diane Sindall in 1986. Oh, okay, because this happened before I was born. Oh, wait, hang on. The problem is that Peter Sullivan was apparently an entirely innocent man. Why have I heard of Peter Sullivan? This name is definitely ringing bells right now. Anyway, and it was only thanks to recent advances in DNA profiling, an increasingly common plot twist these days, that his conviction was finally quashed in 2025 after Sullivan had spent no less than 38 years behind bars at HMP Wakefield for a crime that he did not commit. Oh my god, that is insane. Basically, this guy, I was born in 87 and I'm 38 years old. So this guy has been in prison for something he didn't do for the entire length of my life, which feels fucking long sometimes. That sounds like I'm like, oh, I'm about done with this. No, I'm not. But it is a really long time. 38 years is a long time. Especially like I don't know, this isn't relevant at all, but those like 1 to 20, holy shit, did that drag. Like thinking about it, like back now, you're like, oh my god, those 7 years that I went to high school, or secondary school as we call it in the UK, and like sat through double maths and double English for like an hour and 20 minutes. That felt so long. Now an hour and 20 minutes goes by, it's like, boom, it's done. So I imagine his diary for the 13th of May would run along the lines of this. Cornflakes for breakfast again this morning. Slasher Spencer got loads more than me as usual. Finally got freed from prison after 38 years because they realised that they'd gotten the wrong guy, so that's a bit of good news. What a flippin' palaver. It only happened to me. Buy some new underpants. Oh my god. Do you get like loads of money? Is he going to become... Please tell me they at least they should give him a few million quid, right? I would say, like, false imprisonment, you should be looking at absolute bare minimum of, 100 grand a year? So we should be giving this guy 3.8 million? Which, I mean, I know it's like the court system did it, and yeah, innocent people go to prison sometimes, but there should be some compensation for this, right? Please. On the plus side, you might imagine that at least Peter Sullivan must surely be in line for a juicy compensation package following such a momentous cock-up. But it looks as if even that's going to be an uphill battle, and it's not a certainty that he'll ever receive a single penny. This feels very British. I feel like if this happened in America, they'd be like, give him a billy. Break him off $1 billion from the government's coffers. In the UK, they're just like, stiff upper lip, old chap. Back to the mines. It's like, oh no, the mines have closed. I don't know what Peter Sullivan did before he went to... Oh, he's 68. He's retired. He's going to be on a government pension now? Oh my god, that's depressing. They took away his whole life, and now he's just going to be like on a government pension for like £4 a week or whatever it is. But how was he found guilty of the murder of Diane Sindall in the first place, and how was he allowed to languish in prison for such an unfathomably long time? Was this the fault of a bungled police investigation, a dodgy trial, or the utterly useless UK appeal process? Why is a wrongly convicted man more likely to spend over twice as much in prison as a guilty one? Probably because he never said he did it, so he didn't show remorse, which is insane because he didn't do it. And he just stuck by his guns. Oh my god. It's like one of those decisions where you're like, it's so weighty. And another thing, if Peter Sullivan really was an innocent man all along, then why did he make multiple confessions to the murder upon his arrest, only to change his mind when his solicitor finally told him to put a sock in it? Well, because police interrogations, they're really good at getting you to confess to things. It's like the whole point. Always shut your mouth. Lawyer, lawyer, lawyer. Just get the lawyer. Doesn't matter if you're innocent. Doesn't matter if you're guilty. Get the fucking lawyer and don't be an idiot. A shadow darker than the rest. In terms of being dealt a pretty poor hand in life, it's difficult to think of too many things that would be worse than spending 38 years in prison in one of the toughest high-security prisons in the UK for a crime that you did not commit. It's got to be right up there with being buried alive, discovering that Alex Jones is your biological father, and being allergic to fried chicken. These are all some of my greatest fears. The thought of ever being sent to the slammer gives... I've done the DNA thing, where it tells you where you're from, or like who your parents are. Close enough. And I know Alex Jones isn't my biological dad, because you can just tell. You're just like, oh no, well, Alex Jones isn't from there, is he? He's from the depths of hell. The thought of ever being sent to the slammer gives me the proper heebie-jeebies, as I'm far too pretty for prison. But I usually do my best to avoid such a nightmare scenario playing out by behaving like a model citizen at all times and hardly ever murdering anyone. So it's got to feel like a kick in the nether regions if you go out of your way not to break the law but still end up getting sent down for somebody else's crime. And not just any old crime. For 38 years, the Beast of Birkenhead was considered to be one of the most vile excuses for a human being in the UK because of the truly sickening nature of what he didn't actually do to Diane Sindall. 21-year-old Diane hailed from the district of Seacombe and Wirral in Merseyside in northwest England. She had recently set up a floristry business with the help of her uncle and could often be seen driving around the area in a blue Fiat van delivering flowers. Diane was planning to get married to her fiancé the following year. To help raise money for the wedding, she also worked evening shifts as a barmaid at the Wellington Hotel in the town of Birmingham, less than 4 miles away from home. And it was here that she wound up her shift at 11:45 p.m. on the night of August 1st, 1986, and hopped into her Fiat van to make a short journey back to Seacombe. Unfortunately, she quickly ran into a big problem. Just over a mile into her journey, the van ran out of petrol on Borough Road in the town of Birkenhead. Undeterred, Diane grabbed a jerry can from the van and marched away into the midnight gloom, presumably in search of the nearest petrol station or perhaps the house of a friend who could help her out of this pickle. We know this because 2 joiners who had been working late at a nearby car accessory store had spotted Diane that night. One of the joiners had noticed the blue Fiat van pull up by the roadside, whilst the other guy saw a young woman leaving the vehicle with a jerry can in her hand, heading off in the direction of the suburb of Tranmere. Shortly after midnight, a taxi driver reported that he'd seen a young woman matching Diane's description engaging in an argument with a man on Borough Road. He noted that at one point, the man put his hands out toward the woman. He felt that they knew each other, and that he may have presumed that they were a young couple having some kind of late-night public domestic. Yeah, it doesn't seem unreasonable. I mean, it's like, oh, that's a bit odd, but not odd enough to do something about it, right? Between 12:30 and 2 a.m., other witnesses who lived nearby claimed to have heard alarming sounds, which suggested that the situation had evolved into something that went way beyond any minor domestic. They heard a woman screaming. Diane was not seen or heard again for the remainder of the night. As is so often the case, it was a dog walker who made the grim discovery the next day. That's why I don't have a dog. Around 12 hours after, Diane Sindall was seen getting out of her Fiat van and becoming embroiled in an argument with an unidentified man. The dog walker found Diane's body in a rarely used alleyway just off Borough Road. How rarely used could it be if she's literally discovered the next morning? Only very partially concealed by vegetation, the body was practically naked, aside from Diane's t-shirt and bra hanging loosely from her neck. All of her other clothes were missing, along with her shoes. Perhaps surprisingly, none of her jewelry had been touched at all, indicating that the attack was not a mugging driven by theft of valuable items, but something far more disturbing. The nature of her injuries can only be described as utterly horrific. In fact, the pathologist who later examined the body claimed that they were the worst injuries he had ever seen outside of a road accident. Oh my lord. And like road accident in the 80s, cars were a fucking disaster, dude. Like, I've been in cars from the 80s. It's like, what's this? It's like, oh, it's an early version of a seatbelt. What's this? That's no crumple zone. What's this? Oh, it's a spike. Cars are crazy. I always remember my dad saying, back in the day, everyone knew someone who died in a car accident. Now, I don't know anyone who died in a car accident, because cars got real safe. I certainly don't want to dwell on the details, but I think it's important to understand why the murder of Diane Sindall sparked such fear and revulsion in Merseyside, and why so many local women of the area were subsequently afraid to go out at night in case they crossed paths with the Wolfman. You might want to skip ahead for a minute if you'd rather not know. Well, thanks, Danny. I don't have a choice, do I? Diane's skull, jaw, and thyroid cartilage were fractured, possibly after being beaten repeatedly with a heavy object such as a brick or a crowbar. Her face was lacerated and bruised heavily. Her genitals were also lacerated, while one of her nipples had been mutilated and the other one bitten off entirely. The actual cause of death was deemed to be a brain hemorrhage, which was more than likely brought on by the repeated blows to the head. It would appear that Diane Sindall had been subject to the most brutal and depraved sexual assault and extreme physical violence before her body was dragged into an alleyway on Borough Road, and she wouldn't even be granted the mercy of a quick release from her pain. It's believed that she may have still been alive for quite some time in that alleyway before she eventually succumbed to the brain hemorrhage. One of the first mysteries to solve was the whereabouts. Thanks for keeping that brief, Danny. That was like, you got across the horror of it very clinically, and I appreciate that. This isn't a gore horror true crime podcast. If you want that, you can. There are plenty of options, don't worry. It's not this show. So one of the first mysteries to solve was the whereabouts of Diane's missing clothing, and this was answered by the very next day in a find which also led to the questioning of one of the first major suspects. Witnesses had come forward to report that the morning after the murder they'd spotted a small fire burning somewhere in the 100-acre spot of woodland known as Bidston Hill, a couple of miles away from the crime scene. When police officers turned up to investigate, they found that somebody had recently sparked up 2 separate small fires in the woodland, and Diane's burnt missing clothes and possessions were scattered amongst the ash. The killer had somewhat curiously made an attempt to cover his tracks and burn most of the evidence a couple of miles away, whilst leaving Diane's t-shirt and bra behind at the alleyway. Yeah, I was like, what? However, a promising new lead arose from the smoke at Bidston Hill. A couple who just happened to be strolling through the woods on that morning spotted the fires from a distance, but they also spotted something of more immediate significance: a man running away from the scene, and what's more, they believed that they may have recognized him. They reckoned that it was a guy called Pete, who could regularly be seen drinking around the pubs of Birkenhead. This immediately led the police to the doorstep of 29-year-old Peter Sullivan, our innocent man, who had already been on their radar as he was known to have been drinking heavily at a pub called the Crown Hotel in Birkenhead on that night, which was only a relatively short walk from the murder scene. Pretty much everyone who was known to have been enjoying a drink in a local pub on that night was likely to have already been questioned by the police. It has to be said that we don't really know an awful lot about the life of Peter Sullivan, as very few details about him were ever made public. We know that he used to be a choir boy, and then he went on to become a labourer, though he was out of work in 1986. He was described as having learning difficulties, being something of a loner, which made me assume for a long time that he was a single man who largely lived a life of solitude. But I later came across a genuine quote from his own mother which described him as being married and having a kid, although I found no other reference to this anywhere else. This does seem a bit at odds with the usual descriptions of Sullivan, but I'm inclined to agree that his mother knew what she was talking about. Why would we doubt it? Just because there's no other reference, there doesn't need to be. Unless his mother's lying, which would be really weird. Yeah. At the risk of sounding judgmental, the few publicly released photographs of Sullivan do seem to depict quite a strange and disturbed young man who seems to be bewildered by everything around him. He kind of looks a bit like Mr. Bean's sinister older brother. And I'm sure a lot of people, okay, I admit I'm including myself here, would take one look at his photograph and exclaim how it's blindingly obvious that this man is a murderer or a sexual predator. It's gotta suck if just your vibe is sexual predator. It's like, oh no, that's John. God, John looks fucking creepy. No, he's a normal dude. It's like, yeah, but I don't trust him. Just because he's got sexual predator vibes. Nothing in his behavior, just the way he looks. He looks like a word I can't say on YouTube. And everyone knows, people have that, there is that look with those glasses. Just goes to show how wrong you can be and why you should never judge a pie by the crust. The police grew more suspicious when they eventually tracked down Peter Sullivan, carrying a large suitcase and heading to the train station where he intended to make a journey to London. Could it be that he was attempting to make a hasty exit before he could be identified, but had left it just a little too late? Well, maybe not. In retrospect, we know the answer's no. The couple who claimed to recognize the guy running away from a fire at Bidston Hill as a local man named Pete were invited to pick Sullivan out of an identity parade, and they utterly failed to do so. Is that what it's called? I thought it was called a lineup. Is that just what Americans call it? In my mind, it's always been a lineup. Identity parade sounds like way too much fun. Shouldn't use parade outside of a joyous situation, right? It's a parade. Maybe they were thinking of a different Pete. What, just someone who also happened to look like him, also called Pete? Not that it really mattered much anyway, as Peter Sullivan was happy to admit that he had indeed been at Bidston Hill on that morning, but he reckoned that he'd just been caught short and had nipped behind some bushes to take a piss in privacy. The police were satisfied with Sullivan's reasons for his planned trip to London and his account of his movements on the night of the murder, at least for now. And so the hunt for other suspects continued in what evolved into one of the biggest ever murder investigations in the history of the Merseyside police force. Over the next few weeks, over 3,000 people were questioned, and at one point it was reported that detectives were considering interviewing every man in Birkenhead, a town with a total population of over 100,000 people. They just interview 50,000 people. That's a giant stadium full of people. How? But the total lack of witnesses to the actual attack in the early hours of the morning was proving to be problematic. Yes, we had witnesses who spotted Diane Sindall getting out of her van to find petrol, and another witness who saw an argument between Diane and an unknown man whom she appeared to know, but nothing at all after this, aside from a man running away from a fire at Bidston Hill in which the victim's clothes were burned. In the meantime, the people of the county of Merseyside, particularly the women, were understandably getting rather edgy over how long it was taking to catch the monster known as the Merseyside Ripper, the Wolfman, and the Beast of Birkenhead. And there was growing anxiety that he might strike again before he was caught. Yeah, no shit, of course there would be. The Liverpool Echo journalist John Thompson recalls that there was genuine terror on the streets and that young women were afraid to be out on their own at any time of day. Even just getting home from work was an issue for non-driving women, as the thought of catching public transport was considered far too risky. Fathers, brothers, boyfriends and husbands would pick women up from the workplace whilst pleading with them not to leave the building until the car was parked right outside the exit. Josephine Woods worked for an organisation which is still running today under the name of R-Word and Sexual Abuse Centre. I'm assuming they actually use the word rather than say R-Word. Because it was back in the day, and also outside of places like YouTube, we can say the R-word because it's not offensive. It's just a word to describe a crime, like murder or genocide, or Rasa Merseyside, which offers support to all women who've been affected by sexual violence. The organisation was originally set up as a direct consequence of the brutal assault and murder of Diane Sindall by local women who felt that enough was enough. Josephine Wood can still vividly recall the terrifying environment in which Rasa Merseyside was founded. She remembers quoting her, "It was the sheer normality of it that was so crazy, because any of us could have just run out of petrol and been walking along that road." Yeah, random crimes like this, fucking scary. Like Danny and his prison thing. It's like, you can do everything right, and you can still be the victim of a crime. Like, you can still be falsely imprisoned for a crime that you didn't do. That fucking sucks. The White Noise Revisited. A new breakthrough in the case emerged just a few weeks later, which appeared to promise fresh peace of mind to the petrified citizens of Merseyside. While I say it was a new breakthrough, it was more of a case of circling right back to the original suspect. The murder of Diane Sindall was reconstructed on the BBC's Crime Watch. Oh my god, I remember Crime Watch. I used to watch Crime Watch at my nan's house. A long-running TV show in which the original co-presenter, Nick Ross, regularly rounded off each show by urging viewers not to have nightmares after just having been bombarded with the most nightmarish content you could imagine. Why did my nan let me watch Crime Watch? Why was Crime Watch on at like 5 in the afternoon? I am thinking of I'm thinking of Crime Stoppers, which was probably like a little bit milder than this, because I don't remember any horrible murders. It was usually like someone's nicked someone's dog. It was also famous for an unpleasantly surreal edition in 1999. Oh my god, I forgot about this. Yes, in which the main case covered was the murder of Crime Watch's own co-presenter Jill Dando. I've made a video about this. Wild. Coincidentally, this led to the arrest of a man called Barry George, who was later convicted of a murder and served 7 years in prison before his conviction was quashed and the case was never solved. Barry George, 7 years. You lightweight. Oh, Petey here did 38 years. Barry George wouldn't even break $1 million in my $100,000 a year compensation scheme. This particular 1986 edition of Crime Watch featured a simple, dramatized reconstruction of the events leading up to the murder of Diane Sindall, and it generated quite a few calls from the public. But they weren't exactly new leads. The calls were made from people who claimed to have seen a man wandering around Bidston Hill the morning after Diane was murdered. A man who also matched Peter Sullivan's description. Detectives may initially have felt a little disappointed by this outcome, as it had already been established that Sullivan had been wandering around the woods that morning in search of somewhere to have a slash. Have a slash? Danny didn't write that, I just used it. It's one of my favourite ways of saying that you need to have a pee, because it absolutely baffles Americans and anyone who's not British. Anytime I'm around other people who are not British, I'll be like, gonna take a slash. And they'll be like, what? I just like that. Don't know why. Anyway, so he's off taking his slash. But they dragged him in for further questioning anyway, and this time they were far from satisfied with his responses. When Sullivan was pressed again about his movements on that morning and the previous night, detectives became suspicious when they found that he was now telling them stuff which completely contradicted his original statements from when he was first questioned. Not only that, but he now seemed to be struggling to stick to the same story for more than about 5 minutes. I mean, if I didn't know he was innocent, I'll be like, this is suspicious, but this can be like a stress response. You haven't thought it through very much. You don't remember your previous answers, which obviously that's bad because it should be the same story. But you could just forget what happens, because you deem it like not super, although you would deem it important if you've been potentially arrested for murder. I feel like there's reasons why it wouldn't match up that could be innocent. Peter Sullivan was arrested on the 23rd of September on suspicion of murder, and he was initially denied access to legal representation for 2 days on the grounds that detectives believe this may prove to be a hindrance to the ongoing inquiry. I don't think that's how it works, guys. And during this period, Peter Sullivan had quite a lot to say for himself. In fact, he sang like a canary about how he'd murdered Diane Sindall. How can he be denied legal representation? That's insane. That's not right. Surely that's illegal. In fact, he sang like a canary. Well, he sang like a very confused canary who was noticeably light on detail and didn't always seem to know the next line of the song. At first, he continued to plead his innocence by providing ever-changing versions of his movements until he eventually cracked under the conditions of the intense interrogation and broke down in tears, confessing in full to the murder. Later that same day, he retracted the confession and claimed that it wasn't him after all, but by the next day had decided that he was guilty again and made another confession. I'm sure it's all based on how hard the police are leaning on him at that moment. Like he wakes up and he's like, oh my god, what have I done? Why have I confessed to this? And then they get him back in the interrogation room, they lean on him a little bit more and he's like, no, this is miserable, yeah, I did it. Sullivan claimed that he'd hit the victim repeatedly with a brick, then headed off to Bidston Hill the following morning, where he burnt Diane's clothes along with a pair of his own brown trousers that he had worn during the murder. He said that he couldn't remember exactly why he had committed such an appalling act, but presumed that he must have just been very, very drunk. It's probably a good job that Sullivan was eventually allowed access to a solicitor by the following morning, otherwise he may have ended up confessing to every unsolved murder in northwest England over the past 25 years. Well, that would have been a big boon for the police, wouldn't it? After speaking to his solicitor, Sullivan retracted his second confession and never claimed to have been involved in the murder of Diane Sindall again. He alleged that he had just fabricated the confessions and that in truth he had no idea who was responsible. The damage may have already been done, though. Surely that is going to get ripped apart in court when they're like, he didn't have any legal representation and the police pressured him. Of course he made a confession. People do. All the time. Detectives now pieced together a story in which Peter Sullivan had been playing for a local darts team that night at the Crown Hotel in Birkenhead. The night went badly for Sullivan's team as they were soundly thrashed into humiliation, and Sullivan took this rather badly. After drowning his sorrows with countless pints of lager, he eventually staggered his way out of the pub at around 11:30, which would have given him just enough time to make it to Borough Road shortly after Diane Sindall's van ran out of petrol. Daddy wrote 11:30 a.m. and I'm like, oh, that was a long night. But it's a typo. One of his own neighbours revealed that he had heard Sullivan had recently borrowed a crowbar from somewhere and pondered over whether Sullivan may have been brandishing this weapon whilst making his way home. Right. This is very speculative, coppers, isn't it? Shortly after midnight, Sullivan bumped into Diane, engaged in a short hostile conversation with her before he let fly with a crowbar in a drunken, senseless rage, taking out his frustrations over a bad night down at the pub on a young woman who was just trying to fill up a jerry can. After assaulting his victim in the manner of a crazed wild animal, he then dragged Diane into the alleyway off Borough Road before removing most of her clothes and staggering his way back home to his modest house in Queensbury Gardens. At some point, it's the past, isn't it? How an unemployed guy who was previously a labourer has a modest house. I feel like this is just more and more of a, like, please, these days. Fucking property in the UK, Christ. I think property anywhere, dude. At some point early in the morning, he then took the clothes to Bidston Hill and tried to burn the evidence in a couple of small fires. He may have been too drunk to even remember that he left the victim's bra and t-shirt behind at the crime scene. Again, it's not clear how a wife and child would have slotted into this scenario, as they presumably may have had a few questions over why Sullivan had returned home covered in blood and clutching a pile of blood-stained women's clothing, although the lateness of the hour might suggest that they were in bed during his departure and subsequent early morning exit. There were a couple of other bits of evidence, although one of them would remain useless for the next 3 decades. The DNA, yes. A sample of semen was found on top of Diane's abdomen, but the forensic technology simply did not exist in 1986 to analyze such a small sample, which had also been partially diluted from the rainfall. But there was something else. The horrific bite marks on Diane's breast had left a dental impression on the body. Peter Sullivan had quite distinctive teeth, and not the most charming smile in the world, as several of them were missing. After the bite marks were examined by forensic odontologists, learned a new word today, it was concluded by dental experts that they were a perfect match for Peter Sullivan's unique dental pattern. And so, by the time Sullivan faced trial for the murder of Diane Sindall in Liverpool Crown Court in early 1987, things were not looking particularly promising for the prime suspect. Wow. The confessions, and people saying these are your bite marks on her. That's a lot. That's going to be really hard. The bite marks there especially. The prosecution team were able to wheel in a dental expert who confirmed that the bite marks on the victim's breasts were made by Peter Sullivan, whilst the jury was also told of the defendant's 2 separate confessions upon his arrest, only one of which was actually recorded and both of which were retracted when he was finally allowed access to legal representation. On top of this, there were also multiple witnesses who reported seeing Sullivan loitering around Bidston Hill the following morning shortly after the evidence was burned to a crisp, and there was the neighbour who claimed that he had heard Sullivan had borrowed a crowbar with which he may have been armed that night. It's so speculative. Peter Sullivan pleaded not guilty to the charge of murder and still insisted that he had just nipped into Bidston Hill to have a whiz. Another phrase for taking a leak, having a slash, that I like. He denied ever borrowing a crowbar from anyone, and this was never proven. And if we were to believe that his original confessions were genuine, it would seem odd that he made no mention of a crowbar and instead claimed to have used a brick. One fresh detail that emerged during the trial is that while Sullivan was being held in custody, the police had received an anonymous call from a man who claimed to have murdered Diane Sindall and later burned her clothes at Bidston Hill. Oh, right. He later called to retract his confession, which was pretty useless anyway, as he never divulged his name, and the police quickly discounted it altogether as they felt they already had a strong case against Peter Sullivan. Ah, yes, the old railroading. It's like, no, we got our guy. He says he's not our guy. Why don't we listen to you? We already had one confession, and he confessed first. That's just good police work. And it was certainly a strong case in the eyes of the jury. Wait, why does he have a jury? Why does he have a trial? Why not just send him straight to prison? I mean, he didn't get a lawyer. Might as well just skip the whole justice part altogether and just bang him right up. Come on. What is this? America? We don't have a constitution. We don't have these nonsense rights, like a right to a fair trial. That is in the Constitution, right? I think it is, the American Constitution. The UK, interestingly, doesn't have a constitution, along with New Zealand and Israel. At least it didn't when I studied law. It was a long time ago. I always found that. Constitutional law, super interesting, was my favourite subject. Sullivan was found guilty of the murder of Diane Sindall and handed a life sentence with a minimum term of 16 years, although, of course, he ended up serving well over twice that time in HMP Wakefield. During the sentencing, his mother Margaret screamed and broke down in tears while his sister fainted. Peter Sullivan himself remained silent and calm, and some might say, rather perplexed. DS Tom Baxter, who worked on the investigation, later told the press that Sullivan, quote, wasn't an excitable person. He seemed to be a quiet sort of fellow. But what is the type of person that commits these murders? And that could be a killer question, which the police spectacularly failed to get right. I hang suspended. Peter Sullivan may have spent 2 days without a solicitor confessing to the murder, but he would spend the next 38 years consistently pleading his innocence, supported for the last 20 of those by a solicitor, Sarah Myatt. An article from the Liverpool Echo, published in 1987, revealed how his parents, Margaret and Charles, were always utterly convinced of their son's innocence. Charles explained how Sullivan respected women, but rather harshly described him as, quote, a complete coward. That's your son, dude. Fucking bitch coward. What? That's so mean. He's a very placid guy who will do anybody a good turn. Really harmless. If you spoke to him abruptly, he'd walk away. He's not one who would stand his ground or put up a fight. Meanwhile, his mother Margaret claimed, my son is no monstrous killer. He is incapable of something like this, and finding him guilty makes a farce out of British justice. The whole of Birkenhead knows he is innocent. It has to be said that there were compelling reasons driving the jury to a guilty verdict. Yet the confession and the bite marks, dude. The bite marks is forensic evidence. I'm surprised, didn't the defense have an expert to be like, dude, no, clearly not. His presence at the scene of the fires at Bidston Hill, that's eyewitness stuff. I feel like that's even weaker. Although he did say he was there having a whiz, didn't he? I feel like his solicitor would just be like, don't say that. Just don't say it. Don't say you were there. Just don't. Maybe you should. I don't know. I don't know. Not a lawyer. But judging by the amount of witnesses who claim to have spotted him, it sounds as if half of Birkenhead was wandering around Bidston Hill on that morning, and it seems unfair to pick on the man who just needed somewhere to pee. Still, you can't argue with the hard evidence, such as the bite mark forensics. According to the dental expert questioned by the prosecution during the trial, the bite marks on Diane's breasts matched the distinctive dental pattern of Peter Sullivan. But hang on a second, it turns out that we can argue with this after all. Bite mark analysis has since been condemned by several leading scientific bodies as complete poppycock, with no scientific basis. Oh, I had no idea. I kind of thought that would be forensic evidence, and they just screwed it up. It's now widely dismissed as unreliable evidence under UK law, and whilst it can still occasionally be used to exclude suspects, bite mark analysis doesn't carry enough weight or data for a positive identification. The worrying point here is that bite mark analysis was a controversial technique even back in 1987, and expert dentist Professor Ian Pretty was quick to publicly criticise how the supposed evidence was presented at trial. Yet the jury was never given an opportunity to hear a conflicting expert opinion. Why not? Surely you have an expert for the defence. They were simply told that the bite marks matched Peter Sullivan's teeth, and that was that. At one point, the prosecution team even suggested to the jury that this evidence was so important, they may as well disregard the rest of the case. Well, I mean, yeah, they're the prosecution. It's kind of their job to get that guilty verdict. And if that were true, the jury may as well not have bothered turning up at all. So that just leaves us with the confessions. Why would an innocent man ever confess to a grisly murder that would surely lead to a life sentence? Even without a solicitor present, you'd think that a rational, innocent man would just tell the truth instead of waiting to be advised to do so by a legal representative. Yeah, but we've already established that the police are really good at getting confessions. Even if you haven't done it, they're still really good at getting confessions. Well, we already know that Peter Sullivan had learning difficulties. Following an assessment of Sullivan, the psychologist Dr. Harry Wood later went much further, suggesting that the suspect was also highly suggestible. In his words, quote, "The appellant was extremely vulnerable in an interrogative situation because of his limited intellectual functioning combined with his problems with self-expression, his disposition to acquiesce, to yield, to be influenced, manipulated and controlled, and his internal pressure to speak without reflection and his tendency to engage in make-believe to an extreme extent. What he was saying was nonsense, in plain terms." End quote. We also have to consider the conditions under which Sullivan was aggressively interrogated by detectives. Yeah, and these are conditions where, intellectually astute people can get things wrong, which is why we have lawyers. For someone who isn't that intellectually astute, this is really dangerous grounds. Conditions which would be illegal today, and in fact should have technically been illegal back then. Some people may have presumed that suspects in the UK would naturally have a legal right to see a lawyer when being questioned by the police, certainly by the enlightened age of the 1980s. The legal right to see an attorney was kind of established in the US way back in 1791 in the Sixth Amendment, although this was initially interpreted as only applying to federal cases in which a wealthy suspect could actually afford to hire one. The US would have to wait another 170 years before landmark cases such as the 1963 Gideon and Wainwright trial, which established the suspects in all state felony cases were entitled to legal counsel, which would be provided by the state if the suspect couldn't afford it. And it wasn't until 3 years later that the Supreme Court case of Miranda in Arizona established that suspects must be informed by police of these rights as part of the Miranda warning. But can you imagine the police when that was ruled? They're like, wait, we have to tell people we suspect of crimes that they can have a lawyer? That's well against our interests, mate. And they're like, yeah, it's also called justice. It's also called fairness. But the UK was hardly in a rush to follow suit. I can't believe this came so late. And we had to wait until the 1984 this was 1986 when it happened, no? The Police and Criminal Evidence Act introduced sweeping changes in codes of practice, including a suspect's legal right to see a solicitor and new laws on confessions, which could now only be put to a jury if it could be proven that on the balance of probabilities, they were not obtained by oppression. Before this act, the right to legal representation in the UK was a pretty foggy area, which was never consistently applied. The Act only came into force in 1986 and should have been followed during the interrogation of Peter Sullivan, but it apparently took a while for certain police forces to get to grips with these strange new rules. How weird. Wait, this guy gets to have someone like real smart and knowledge of the law help them out? How are we ever going to get people to confess with that? That's crazy! Sullivan later claimed that he was verbally abused and physically assaulted during those initial 2 days without a solicitor. We'll never know for sure what happened in that closed room because there were no other witnesses aside from Sullivan and the interrogators. And the point is that there definitely should have been other witnesses. It's possible that detectives took a highly confrontational and accusatory approach with a highly suggestible man with learning difficulties who even described himself as a born liar. And in the absence of a lawyer or appropriate adult, Sullivan just told them what he thought they wanted to hear and provided false confessions. He would have admitted to invading Poland in 1939 if you'd given him enough time. Whilst detectives had initially grown suspicious because Sullivan's varied accounts of his movements were contradictory, his subsequent confessions were equally incoherent and all over the place. Yeah, but that's not in the police's interest, is it? Just gotta be very selective with what you choose. And yet the jury at the trial were given a picture in which Sullivan had made genuine logical confessions that he only fully retracted when a crafty solicitor turned up and started whispering in his ear that he might just get away with it if he changed his story. God, that's so compelling for a jury though, isn't it? Because they're just getting one side of the story from the prosecution and the defense is like, no? So now there's serious doubt lingering over Sullivan's conviction, but he was still destined to widely be considered by the British public as one of the most sickening criminals in recent history for the next 38 years, barely a human being at all, rather a frenzied wolfman or a beast. And he probably wouldn't have been able to find too much comfort in the company of his fellow inmates at the Category A prison HMP Wakefield, which is often nicknamed Monster Mansion, and is home to around 750 of the most dangerous and notorious criminals in the UK. His long list of bunkies included Dr. Harold Shipman, Jesus, who murdered an estimated 250 patients before taking his own life in HMP Wakefield in 2004. Honestly, though, if I was in prison, it's oh no, I'm in prison and I've done for murders that I accidentally confessed to, and the stupid dental thing. It's who do you want to share a cell with? Slasher Steve, who murdered 70 men, or Harold Shipman, who was kind of a pudgy old doctor. Who, absolute monster, but probably not a violent man. It also includes Ian Huntley. Yeah, for example, Ian Huntley would much rather share a cell with the psycho that is Dr. Harold Shipman, who murdered two 10-year-old girls in 2002, Reinhard Sinaga, who was convicted of 159 sex offences on young men, and Charles Bronson, not that one obviously, who is regarded as the most violent prisoner in the UK and could potentially have been released decades ago but can't seem to stay out of trouble in the slammer. Peter Sullivan later described HMP Wakefield as the worst environment imaginable and stated, "I will not comment on the horrors done to me over that time. There are too many." But neither he nor his solicitor Sarah March were in the mood to give up the fight to prove Sullivan's innocence. They would just need to exercise a little patience. And when I say a little, I mean a metric buttload that few of us could realistically hope to muster over the course of 14,113 grueling days trapped inside Monster Mansion. Isn't 38 years basically the length of a legal career? Because you're a lawyer, right? So you're probably going to retire a couple of years early. This was back in the day, although now it's present day. So let's say you retire at, 62. Just picking a slightly early retirement age. What is retirement age these days? Maybe it's 70. That's really old. I mean, I don't know. I don't really see myself ever retiring, but there's lots of stuff I've said during my life, and then you change your mind, as you get a bit old and a bit, more creaky in your bones. But 70's old, dude. But I feel like 38 years probably be an entire legal career, so she's just been fighting the good fight for that long. Stuck on Amber. In 2008, Peter Sullivan made his first appeal to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the independent body that supposedly reviews potential miscarriages of justice and decides on whether a case should be referred to the Court of Appeal. By this time, of course, Sullivan had already served 19 years in prison, 3 years more than the imposed minimum sentence. As far as we know, Sullivan tried to keep his head down in HMP Wakefield and stay out of trouble, but he was never granted a release by the parole board. Now, there's common myth that it is a strict legal requirement in the UK for a prisoner to admit their guilt before they can even be considered for early release from a life sentence. When I said that earlier, I didn't mean that it's absolutely mandatory. I just think it is something that is taken into consideration by a parole board, right? Whilst denial of guilt can be an influential factor in some cases, it is meant to be unlawful for a parole board to refuse a release purely on these grounds. This decision is based on a whole bunch of factors, but it's meant to be primarily focused on risk assessment and whether or not the prisoner is likely to still pose a threat to the public if granted release. But, technically unlawful or not, some of the recent stats do make you wonder how much the continued denial of guilt can affect the chances of an early release. Peter Sullivan, given a 16-year minimum sentence, no reports of bad behaviour, never granted parole, and served 38 years. Victor Neelan, British postman who was wrongly convicted in 1997 for the attempted sexual assault of a young woman, was given a discretionary life sentence with a recommended minimum term of 7 years. No reports of bad behaviour, continued to plead innocent, was never granted parole, and was eventually released 17 years later when his conviction was quashed after new DNA evidence proved he was not guilty. Whoa, holy shit. Andrew Malkinson, unemployed man who was wrongfully convicted of sexual assault in 2004, sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 6.5 years. No reports of bad behaviour, continued to plead innocence, was only granted parole for good behaviour almost 17 years later, and his conviction was eventually quashed in 2023 when new DNA evidence, proved he was not guilty. You can almost begin to see a pattern forming here. Are we going through and retesting all of the DNA? Because if we're not, we really should be. I'm just going to assume that that's happening, right? Because not only are innocent people in prison, but it means there's guilty people out there who are laughing at those innocent people in prison. Or maybe feeling bad, but probably fucking not. If continuing to deny your guilt poses more of a barrier to an early release than it legally should, then this obviously poses a dilemma for the genuinely innocent prisoner. Do you tell the whole truth to the parole board and risk spending the rest of your life in prison, or do you lie and admit to the crime in hope of an early release? That is a fucking decision and a half. I mean, good news, you're in prison, you've got plenty of time to think about it. Whilst I'm sure many of us would instinctively throw up our hands in horror at the very thought of falsely admitting to crime as grotesque as the one Peter Sullivan was convicted of committing, I'm not convinced that it's really so simple to come up with a definitive answer unless you're dropped in that situation for years and years. If lying through your teeth and falsely admitting to guilt meant you could finally be free again the next month after 20 years in prison, wouldn't it be tempting to seize that opportunity with both hands? I mean, yes, especially if everyone thinks you're that f***ing monster anyway. Besides, it all seems a bit of a silly factor the parole board take into account on any level anyway. Whilst it could be argued that admitting your guilt demonstrates remorse and a desire to engage with rehabilitation, there's nothing really stopping you from publicly proclaiming your innocence again after you've walked out of those prison doors, ideally in a generously paid interview with a tatty tabloid newspaper. Still, Peter Sullivan was most definitely not prepared to admit his guilt to a parole board under any circumstances, and filed an application with the Criminal Cases Review Commission in 2008 on the grounds that forensic samples, notably the small sample of semen, should be examined again using modern techniques which weren't available nearly 20 years earlier. So what the f*** are we doing waiting another 17 years? What is happening? The CCRC rejected the application and declined to refer the case to the Court of Appeals. To be fair, they probably made exactly the right call at the time. Back in 2008, forensic technology would still not have been advanced enough to yield a DNA profile from the sample. Oh, okay. And in fact, making any kind of attempt to examine the sample at this stage could have diluted the evidence and potentially wrecked any chance of conducting tests on the sample in the future. Alright, fair play. What happened over the next few years was a bit bewildering, though. It wasn't until 2019 that Peter Sullivan made another application for appeal, this time directly to the Court of Appeal itself. If I was in prison, I'd be like, all I'd be doing is reading every single article that's released about the latest advancements in DNA technology, being like, come on, someone do something. It doesn't usually work this way around. More often than not, convicted criminals first appeal directly to the Court of Appeal, and it's only when this avenue has been exhausted that they turn to the Criminal Cases Review Commission for potential help from an independent body. Sullivan may have taken an unusual route, but the outcome from this application was equally disappointing. This time around, he was appealing the conviction on the unreliability of the controversial bite mark analysis and the conditions under which he made his confessions. Yeah, also bite mark analysis has been thrown out by this point. Right? However, the Court of Appeal eventually rejected the application in 2021, claiming that the judge of the original trial had ruled the original confessions were admissible evidence, and quite curiously, that the bite mark analysis had not been central to the prosecution team's case. Bro, if you're sitting on the jury and you're being told that that is forensic evidence, like king fingerprints, of course it matters. Because the other one's just a confession under duress. Jesus Christ, Appeals Board. Court of Appeal, sorry, not Appeals Board. This is the same prosecution team who you may remember told the jury at the trial that the bite mark evidence was so important they might as well disregard the rest of the case. Right. Well done, everybody. Very clever. But here's another deeply troubling point, which goes back to the postman Victor Neelan, who served 17 years in prison after being wrongfully convicted of sexual assault. Can you imagine being in that position? Jesus Christ. And it's not just you're going to prison, but it's like your whole family's falling apart. Like, if I was in that position, it'd be like, well, I'm not going to see my kids. My wife's not going to bring the kids to visit me in prison. That's fucking crazy. I mean, assuming that she thinks I'm guilty. But what if the evidence is like really powerful? Because it can be. And you just be like, oh my God, how? But yeah, it's really fucked up. That's super fucked up. Victor's conviction was eventually quashed in 2013 after advances in DNA analysis, including the Y chromosome short tandem repeat technique. It's a bit of a mouthful, which is a type of DNA profiling that isolates and analyzes male DNA, and it proved that the samples collected did not match Victor's profile as originally thought. So, this YSRT technique was available in 2013, and yet years passed without anyone bothering to use it again in questionable cases such as those of Peter Sullivan or Andrew Malkinson, in which the samples of evidence containing potential DNA had not been analysed. It seems that the general feeling here was that the case of Victor Neelan was a one-off glitch, and that there surely wouldn't be any other victims or miscarriages of justice still languishing inside prison for years. I mean, what would be the chances of that? Very high! And I know Danny's being sarcastic, but I just want to emphasize they're very high, and anything that's not being checked should be being checked right now. Because then we could be sure, and we could close the book. Even though people think the book's already been closed. Let's open the book, test things, and then close the book again. And maybe the book will say the same. Maybe it won't. Very importantly, maybe it won't. Shortly after his direct application to the Court of Appeal was rejected, he made a second appeal to the Criminal Cases Review Commission 13 years after the last one. Sullivan was still raising questions about his apparent confessions and the bite mark analysis, but the main emphasis this time was on the semen sample recovered from Diane Sindall's abdomen, which could surely be comprehensively examined by now, proving that it did not belong to Sullivan. Whilst this whole appeal process appears to have been dragged out beyond belief, I'm pleased to report that the CCRC sprang fairly swiftly into action on this occasion and agreed that it was time to look again at the evidence during the very same year. And fresh testing of the evidence that had been preserved in storage for 38 years reached a pretty dramatic conclusion. The sample of semen found on the body of Diane Sindall on the night of her murder did not match the DNA of Peter Sullivan, or to be more accurate, it was 1 billion times more likely that the sample belonged to an as-yet unidentified male. I am wondering how fucking quickly he gets out of prison. If that is found out and the tests come back from the lab, I want him out of prison that same afternoon. Right? Because you know he's innocent. Just immediately. Just as it seemed that things were finally beginning to speed up, there was another inexplicable delay. Whilst the new DNA evidence came to light in 2021 and the CCRC quickly referred the case to the Court of Appeal, it'd be another 4 years before the Court of Appeal found time to hold a hearing, and for Peter Sullivan that was yet another 4 years to endure in the Monster Mansion. Are you absolutely shitting me? I was like, if they keep him in for an extra week, that's a travesty of justice. 4 fucking years? At that point, like, forget my 3.8 million or whatever that he gets, of the £100,000 a year. This is fucking on the government and on the whoever this is, the CCRC and all of this. I want, like, this is where it should be $1 million a year minimum, because you are keeping an innocent man in one of the worst prisons imaginable. He should be getting a fucking lot of money now. The hearing was held at the Royal Courts of Justice in London on the 13th of May 2025, with now 68-year-old Peter Sullivan watching events unfold on a video link from HMP Wakefield. Perhaps surprisingly, there was very little mention of either the bite mark analysis or the dubious confessions, although Sullivan's barrister, Jason Kidder QC, did take the time to point out to the panel of 3 judges that his client was a mentally handicapped fantasist who delivered blatantly wrong answers and inconsistencies when he was first questioned by the bad-tempered detectives. But the focus was largely on the new DNA evidence, which Kidder argued was enough to cast doubt on the safety of the conviction, and that any other evidence could not now pass the threshold which a prosecution could take place. Yeah. Why do we need a hearing for this? The DNA evidence was shown to be bunk. Very least, put him on, really obvious word, parole. Put him out on parole. Give him an ankle monitor, because now we're suddenly not sure. By the end of the hearing, which lasted just a single day, the panel of 3 judges were in agreement. Lord Justice Holroyd told the court, "We have no doubt that it is both necessary and expedient in the interest of justice to accept the new DNA evidence. In light of that evidence, it is impossible to regard the appellant's conviction as safe. Strong though the circumstantial evidence undoubtedly seemed at trial, it is now necessary to take into account the new scientific evidence pointing to someone else, the unknown man, as the attacker. There is no evidence to suggest more than one man was involved in the murder, and no evidence to suggest semen may have been deposited in the process of consensual sexual activity. If the new evidence had been available in 1986, the evidence as a whole would have been considered as insufficient to charge." End quote. Well said, if a bit f***ing late. The conviction was officially quashed by Lord Justice Holroyd, at which point Peter Sullivan became eligible for immediate release that same afternoon. I'm hoping he'd had enough time to pack all his belongings, but he did have 38 years to prepare. He never unpacked. For the majority of the hearing, Sullivan had been listening to events on the video link with his head down and his arms folded. Upon hearing the ruling, he put his hand to his mouth and appeared to briefly weep before turning his head up to the ceiling. He wasn't an excitable person. He seemed to be a quiet sort of fellow. But what is the type of person that spends 38 years in prison for something he didn't even do? Giant steps. Maybe it's a good job we still don't have the death penalty in the UK. If Sullivan had been executed in 1987, his innocence would have never been proved because nobody would have been fighting to appeal the case. We would still today be referring to him either as the Mersey Ripper, the Wolfman, or the Beast of Birkenhead. We now know that he's none of those things and is in fact the longest-serving victim of a miscarriage of justice in UK history, or at least the longest-serving victim that we currently know about. Yeah, let's start with the people who've been in prison for the longest and work back from there, if we're doing this DNA testing thing. Can we get on that? Please tell me someone's doing that. Someone must be doing that, right? I don't know about you, but I'll be a bit miffed about that, and I wouldn't mind telling people about it. Andrew Malkins had certainly had a lot to say after serving 17 years in prison for a sexual assault he did not commit. He publicly criticised the Ministry of Justice for, quote, leaving him to rot, and described himself as incandescent with rage at the Criminal Cases Review Commission and the UK government's compensation scheme, a point we'll get into in just a moment, which he described as an assault on innocent people. But Peter Sullivan took a remarkably different approach in his only public statement, which was read out by a solicitor, Sarah Mart, after the conviction was quashed. Oh, if people are wondering why his lawyer, his solicitor, Sarah Mart, was different from the person representing him in court, it's just how it works in the UK. You have a solicitor who does the case stuff, and then someone else represents you in court. A barrister, it's just how it works. I'd like to reproduce most of his public statement in full because it's the only time we've really ever heard anything from Sullivan, and it's such a surprising statement. Quote, I lost my liberty 4 decades ago over a crime I did not commit. We know now how very different the times we live in are from scientific advances, legal practice, and methods of investigation and questioning by the police. What happened to me was very wrong, but it does not detract or minimize that all of this happened off the back of a heinous and most terrible loss of life. I did not commit murder or unlawfully take the life of any person throughout the span of my own. As God is my witness, it is said, the truth shall set you free. It is unfortunate that it does not give a time scale. As we advance towards resolving the wrongs done to me, I'm not angry, I'm not bitter. I'm simply anxious to return to my loved ones and family, as I've got to make the most of what time is left of the existence I am granted in this world. I humbly request that you allow me my privacy while I begin repairing what I may from the driftwood that is my life. Finally, I'd like to say how sorry I am to the family of Diane Sindall, who have now got to come to terms with the death of their daughter being down to someone else. I long to see the right thing done for this horrible crime, so they will find peace. End quote. And yes, I know Sullivan most likely didn't write a word of it himself. Yeah, for someone who's been described as not the brightest bulb in the... What's the saying? Sharpest tool in the shed? Brightest bulb in the theatre? Where are bright bulbs? Speaking of bright bulbs, this is very nicely written. And he does spend quite a bit of time complaining about the injustice he suffered, and rightly f***ing so, but I don't think anyone can begrudge him that. The point is that the statement encourages the public to remember the 21-year-old victim, Diane Sindall, who was assaulted and murdered in the most horrifying manner, and the family and friends of Diane, who believed for the best part of 4 decades that justice had been served. Sullivan's sister, Kim Smith, expressed similar sentiments outside the royal courts of alleged justice. Quoting her, "We lost Peter for 39 years, and at the end of the day, it's not just us. Peter hasn't won, and neither has the Sindall family. They've lost their daughter. They're not going to get her back." End quote. And let's not forget the young women of Merseyside who were paralysed with fear when it was thought that the beast of Birkenhead was still roaming the region. They may have regained the confidence to walk the streets alone again when Sullivan was found guilty of the murder, but it turns out the real killer was still on the loose all that time. You might think that this would not necessarily be the case, because the real killer could conceivably have ended up in prison anyway after committing an equally horrendous crime. But Merseyside police have been proactively attempting to identify the new DNA profile since they opened the investigation again in 2023. Yeah, surely they just take that sample of DNA and run it through the big database, and all the prisoners have their DNA taken, right? It's not like they're sitting in there being like, nah, you can't have my DNA. They're taking that shit. And they've confirmed that it doesn't match anyone in the National DNA Database, meaning that it does not match any known British criminal. Do we have that internationally? Does something like that exist internationally? If not, it should. Because they could be like someone from abroad. They could be a tourist who's just come in, done a little bit of murder, and then left. I'm still intrigued by the testimony of the taxi driver who passed by Diane Sindall on the night that she was murdered and witnessed some kind of argument with a man whom the taxi driver felt that she knew. Could the killer really have been known to Diane? Oh, I think the answer is yes. The stats of you being killed by someone you know versus someone you don't know, it's like way higher towards people you know, right? Perhaps the taxi driver just reached the wrong conclusion. Over 260 men have been screened and eliminated from inquiry since 2023, and the police are able to confirm that the DNA does not match Diane's fiancé or any member of her family. Are there any countries which have everyone's DNA? Because like some countries will take your fingerprints, all countries basically have your picture for like facial recognition stuff. Is there any countries that take like DNA from the entire population? Because that would make crime solving real easy, and it does feel a little bit onerous. But I think I'd be down for that. Is that really dystopian? But I feel like that's only going to be good for solving crimes. They're not going to like sequence it and, base health insurance stuff on it. Not that we would have that in the UK. But you know what I mean? I don't know. There's probably something really big that I'm not thinking of where this would become incredibly dystopian. But prima facie seems like a decent idea. People would be like, well, I wouldn't give my sample. Well, it's like, well, yeah, you would, because it would be made the law. It's like, well, I'm not getting a driver's license to drive a car. Yes, you are. It's the law. And if you don't, you'll be punished. And then they'll take your DNA when you're punished, like when you're arrested or whatever. Josephine Wood from Rassa, Merseyside, firmly believes that some members of the local community always knew exactly who murdered Diane Sindall, and claims to have held conversations with people who knew for certain that Peter Sullivan was innocent, but were fearful of repercussions if they approached the police. Whoa. Josephine blames the almost tribal culture of certain estates within the area, in which some people live by the rules of snitches get stitches. But then that does make you wonder why anyone would bother raising the subject of Sullivan's innocence at all if they're never going to disclose a name. Well, because there's a big difference between being like, yeah, that guy's innocent, and they're like, well, how do you know? It's like, because I know who did it. And then they're like, well, who was it? Not telling. That's entirely reasonable, because one is like, that guy shouldn't be in prison, and the other one is snitching. As things stand today, the identity of the killer remains a mystery as the investigation continues, whilst suspicions grow that the unknown man who confessed on the telephone was the real beast of Birkenhead all along. One of the natural questions to ask with regard to such a massive miscarriage of justice is where exactly things went so disastrously wrong, or to put it another way, who was to blame for this colossal cock-up? Some have suggested that the original police investigation was so flawed that it may have been a deliberate attempt to cover up for the real killer, who may even have been a police officer himself. They picked on a quiet guy with learning difficulties and stitched him up as he just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That may be something of a leap, but the real issue here is that we don't really know exactly what happened in that interview room over the course of those first 2 days. Sullivan claims he was verbally and physically assaulted, which may or may not be true. However, the police should have given him access to a solicitor or appropriate adult right from the beginning, but instead they took a vulnerable man into a room on his own for 2 days and emerged with unlikely confessions. And this ultimately was the first crooked step on a journey which ended up with a quite reasonable guilty verdict in a deeply flawed trial. Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't blame the jury in this case. Like, that is the verdict that they should have reached based on what they were told. The bite mark thing was crazy that it wasn't properly refuted, and especially when it became bad science later. And then the confessions, like, if you're not properly, if your defense isn't properly being like, well, that's not right, of course the jury's going to say guilty. The jury were told that Sullivan had originally confessed to the crimes before being given legal advice, while dental experts were telling the jury that Peter Sullivan's teeth matched the bite marks on the victim using a procedure that is now widely deemed to have no scientific basis. Exactly. Merseyside police released a statement following the quashing of the conviction, but unlike Peter Sullivan's statement, I feel this one has a lot to be desired. While there's a brief mention of how their thoughts are with the family of Diane Sindall and how they do not underestimate the impact on Mr. Sullivan, there's not the slightest hint of an apology to anyone or any admission of fault on their part. That might be a legal thing, though. Like, I don't know, I've always heard, like, if you're in a car accident and it's clearly your fault, don't say it's your fault. Don't apologize. It's like, you can feel bad and you can be like, in your minds, oh, that was my fault. But it's best to let the insurance companies just figure it out, and maybe you'll get off. The only time I've been in a car accident, like I scraped a guy's car in a car park once. That was my fault. But the only car accident I've been in, a guy just pulled right out in front of me, slammed right into him, and he gets out of the car and he's like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And I'm like, okay, I was I'm just driving along, I'm like, pretty sure this wasn't my fault. This guy's like, this was my fault. And I'm like, yeah, I thought so. Because I was just driving along. And then you are there. I was even going slowly because I just let a guy cross a crossing. And so I was just accelerating away from the crossing. And then this guy just pulls out from behind a bus. And boom! His car was wrecked, bro. My car was okay. 3 months of repairs. But in the end, it was okay. I was driving around this ridiculously tiny BMW i3. Getting 2 children into the back of that for the school run was an interesting experience. Instead, the statement rattles on for ages about how they did their best at the time with the evidence available and how they're now working hard again to identify the real killer. At one point in the statement, they seem to pin any blame for the miscarriage of justice on the jury, as they were the silly sausages who found him guilty on the evidence presented to them. Alright, it's just some shift in the blame, huh? It's not the jury's fault, police. It's on you, allegedly. James Burley, who led an investigation by the charity Appeal into the wrongful conviction of Andrew Malkinson, noted that there was no sign of contrition in Sullivan's case from either the police or the prosecution barristers or the judges on the appeals panel. James reckons, quote, "It's like they're saying, with what was known at the time, this was unavoidable, but aren't you lucky now? The lack of humility is staggering." Bro, a guy was wrongly imprisoned for the majority of his life. The best years. Not the years where it's like you have to go to school and do that bullshit. And not the years when you're like old and crippled. But the best years. The years that, according to my demographics, you and I are in right now. And they are good. It is just nice being quite healthy all the time. It might be handy if somebody at some point looks into exactly what happened during the police investigation and technically illegal interview with Peter Sullivan, although the chances of any consequences in this area might be remote now, bearing in mind that the officers involved will either be long retired or dead. But we also need to look at the wider picture and why it took such an incomprehensibly long time to look again seriously at Peter Sullivan's case. It's true that the Criminal Cases Review Commission probably made the right call back in 2008 when they declined to examine the crucial semen sample, as it could easily have been destroyed during testing, which would not have yielded any results. But so much could have happened in between 2008 and Sullivan's eventual release in 2025. Bite mark analysis was a controversial idea even back in 1987, but it had become very widely discredited by the mid-2010s, and as this had seemed so central to the original guilty verdict, it was perplexing why an appeal wasn't allowed much earlier. It's even more perplexing that the 2019 direct application to the Court of Appeal was rejected partly because it was viewed that the bite mark analysis evidence had not been a crucial factor in the case anyway, which is plainly wrong. The only other real crucial factor in the original trial was those initial confessions, but as it had now long been clear that these had been made under dubious conditions without legal representation, there should have been heavy doubts over the guilty verdict from as early as around 2014. Yeah, I do feel like as much as that bite thing, it's like, yeah, that definitely pushes it to be more likely innocent, or like pushing on innocent, but DNA is like just so fucking irrefutable that it's like, let's just get on that. It's wild that they had to wait so long to get him out of prison, though. That was just insane. This would be 1 year after the conviction for postman Victor Neelan was quashed thanks to that new DNA profiling technology known as the YSRT technique. Yet Sullivan had to spend another 12 years in HMP Wakefield before the very same VSRT technique would be used to prove his innocence. The delays in righting a wrong were frankly appalling and just went on and on. I ask again, what's being done about this? I'm very interested. If anyone in the comments knows what's being done about this, because we really should be getting on this and testing all the people that want it to be tested. It's kind of wild that it's not. Why? DNA testing's incredibly cheap these days. You do it for like $20 with like 23andMe or whatever. Why aren't we doing that? The delays in righting a wrong were frankly appalling and just went on and on. It was proven in 2021 that the DNA sample found at the crime scene did not match Sullivan. 2021. He was just released. By 2023, Merseyside police were clearly convinced that Sullivan was innocent as they had reopened the murder investigation. So why did it take until 2025 for the Court of Appeal to hear the case and for Sullivan to be released? I don't know, but it's a fucking travesty. And this guy should get some sort of compensation for all of the time he spent in prison. But those 4 years is insanity. Perhaps the feeling was that Sullivan had already spent well over 3 decades wrongfully incarcerated in the highest security prison in the UK alongside the nation's most dangerous criminals. He wouldn't really mind enduring a few more. How about you ask him about that? I wonder how he would feel about that. Or perhaps it's because both the Court of Appeal and the Criminal Cases Review Commission just don't seem to like the idea of getting involved in quashing wrongful convictions. Again, the correct word here is travesty. This is just crazy. From the total of 33,341 applications made to the Criminal Cases Review Commission since 1997, only between 1 to 3% of them were referred to the Court of Appeal. I don't give a shit. Just, if it's DNA, just f***ing test it. Test it, and then if it turns out, oh no, you did do it, f***ing send them the bill. And I don't know how it works with prisoners working in, making number plates or whatever, like it does in America. Make them work until that $20 or whatever fucking cost of the DNA test. Let's just say it costs $3,000 because of, government spending. Just make them work it off. What's happening? It's hard to believe that well over 32,000 of those applications should have been rejected without further consideration. There have apparently been numerous cases in which the Court of Appeal has harshly criticised the Criminal Cases Review Commission for referring certain cases back to them, and so now the CCRC are ultra cautious in referring cases and tend to pursue reasons for why applications should be rejected. The CCRC has been described by a former Labour Justice Secretary as unled and generally regarded as useless, while a former Conservative Solicitor General has called for a new, properly functioning independent watchdog. Sounds like a good idea, let's get rid of it. Meanwhile, Chris Henley Casey, a lawyer who in 2025 led a review into the work of the CCRC, told The Guardian, okay, so this is a very intelligent, successful barrister, because he's Casey, King's Counsel, who has looked into this. So I don't know what his words are yet, but we should be taking them oh so very seriously. I think that there is a fundamental problem in relation to our appeal system generally, that it just won't face up to the fact that mistakes can be made. It stubbornly wants to stick to the original flawed conviction. And I mean, to a degree, starting at the point where the courts have decided, yes, this, you should start from the assumption of guilt, because guilt has been established by the courts, that's fine. But you should be looking at mitigating factors or other stuff that's gone on that might show that that is wrong. To start with guilt and then look for stuff that confirms guilt, it just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense for something that is part of the appeals process. If only the CCRC and the Court of Appeal could get their fingers out once in a while, we could potentially see a whole wave of quashed convictions over the next few years by taking advantage of new, and not even particularly new, DNA profiling technology. There are over 1,000 cases in which there were issues or questions about identity, yet somebody still got sent down for sexual assault or murder. Chris Henley Casey recently told BBC Radio's Force Today programme that he feels it is absolutely inevitable that more cases of miscarriage of justice will emerge in the future, but first the appeal system needs to crack on with investigating more appeals. It's not hard! Why is this so hard? Why isn't this just being done yesterday? I'm quite upset about this, it makes no sense. I think having innocent people in prison is a huge issue. There's this general idea, right, beyond all reasonable doubt. The idea that if we're sending someone to be locked up, you've got to be absolutely sure. Because there's the idea that one innocent person in prison is worse than having, say, 20 criminals go free. And I agree with that. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And this just flies in the face of that simple concept. It's embarrassing. I feel a little bit ashamed to be British in this one. This is not right. This is not right at all. Perhaps an endless wave of quashed convictions is exactly what the Court of Appeal is trying to avoid. If each new day brings yet another news story about a person who was wrongfully locked up for decades, it's not going to inspire much faith in the British justice system. Don't give a shit. I don't give a shit. If the faith in the justice system is shaken because of this, then it deserves to be fucking shaken, doesn't it? Doesn't it? It's not complicated. Still, the UK is apparently buckling under the weight of massively overcrowded prisons at the moment, so it could ease the load considerably if thousands of these prisoners end up getting their convictions quashed. The flip side of that coin is that it might put a bit more strain on the police forces who would be tasked with trying to hunt down all the real criminals who should have been there in the first place. If the police are making that argument, that is an insane argument that goes nowhere. There's nothing to that. That's complete nonsense. To make life easier, I suppose they could just go out and arrest anyone who was once seen pissing in the bushes. I tell you what though, poor old Peter Sullivan must surely be looking forward to a pretty hefty compensation package right now. I bet he's not going to be short of a bob or two in the future. Well, actually, it's not quite as simple as that. The UK government does run something called the Miscarriage of Justice Compensation Scheme, but unfortunately it's about as shit as everything else. It will take 2.5 years for his claim to be processed by the system and for a final decision to be made by the Secretary of State for Justice. So in the meantime, he will have to make do with the £89 that he still had in his back pocket when he was shoved out into the streets to start a new life. The absolute maximum compensation that he can claim from the scheme is £1 million, a figure which was set in 2008 has never been increased. So even if he gets top whack after his 2.5-year wait, that still only equates to £26,315 for every year that he spent banged up in Monster Mansion, which is less than the average salary, by the way. This is appalling, UK. Thankfully, he wouldn't have a big chunk of that money deducted for prison food and accommodation. Can you imagine they give it to him? They're like, well, £1 million, 1 year. Yeah, you're looking at about 45% tax on that, mate. So actually, you only made $13,000 a year. Fuck, man. I don't know if that's taxable. I fucking hope not, bro. Up until very recently, the government would rather cheekily claw back that money from victims of miscarriages of justice. The reasoning seemed to be, yes, we wrongfully imprisoned you for many years, but we gave you lodgings and provided you with crap food, so you're going to have to pay for that. How is anyone okay with this? How is this okay? What is happening? This was eventually scrapped in 2023 by then Justice Secretary Alex Chalk, but anyone who got shafted before then will not be reimbursed. But an extra layer of difficulty is that in order to receive any compensation, the applicant has to convince the Secretary of State for Justice that they're innocent beyond any reasonable doubt. This just gets more and more fucked up. And not only could this be quite tricky for any applicant to do, it's also wholly absurd. I was always led to believe that it was innocent until proven guilty, and it was a fundamental principle of British law. But when there's a risk of a big payout, it seems that this principle gets flipped on its head, and the victim of miscarriage of justice remains guilty until they can prove their innocence. It's bonkers. It is. And it's, well, the government's putting their hands on the scale, aren't they? They're like, yeah, different rules for us, mate. Different rules for us. And I mean, f*** you, government. Fuck you. The wrongfully convicted postman Victor Neelan was never able to prove his innocence beyond reasonable doubt after his release, although he took his case all the way to the European Court of Human Rights, and he had to fork out £2,500 in legal costs as he was denied legal aid. Dude, I don't know, £2,500 to take a case to the European Court of Human Rights seems fucking good deal, dude. I don't know, like whenever my lawyer does something, I'm like, oh, man. How did we get to these numbers? Meanwhile, Andrew Malkinson was struggling to pay for rent and food when he was first released from prison in 2020, and he only received his first interim payment for the government scheme in 2025. But even that was after a long and hard battle which generated stacks of media attention. Malkinson is an angry but articulate and intelligent man who regularly spoke about his ordeal to the press and kept his terrible ordeal top of mind. Legend. But it's not quite the same story with Peter Sullivan, a very quiet man who just wants to be left alone in privacy to try and rebuild his life in a strange new world that was very different from the one he left behind in 1987. It's not likely to pop up in the press and garner some public support, and I imagine he may have a hard time in proving his total innocence. The DNA! The DNA doesn't match! It's innocent! What? And receiving a payout that is close to anything he deserves. Then again, how much compensation would be considered adequate for spending 38 years in prison for a grotesque sexual assault and murder that you didn't commit? I mean, okay, so you got to just name a price that you'd be comfortable doing that at. And I truly believe you can put a price on pretty much anything. There's not much I've come up with. It's always like, oh, well, how much would you do that for? I sometimes have this discussion with the guys who sell my ads. And I don't like gambling. I've always said no gambling. And for some reason, I don't know, it must have just been someone from their team or whatever, who just brought me this thing. And I was like, it's a casino. It's just an online casino. It's super dodgy. And I wouldn't do this for $100,000. And it really got me thinking, well, what amount would I do it for? And I don't know, I don't want to think about it because fortunately, there's no amount that is going to match because my amount is going to be so f***ing high to promote gambling, which is something that I don't morally disagree with it. I'm fine if people want to gamble. I'm against like exploitative gambling, where it's kind of like flashes and it's kind of tricky and they kind of get, they exploit it. They use psychological tricks to exploit getting money from you. I don't agree with that. So what amount do you sell out your morals for? Unfortunately, I don't have to think about it because it's an amount that's going to be so high that it's not going to be valuable enough for the brand. But yeah, back to my point, I don't think I wouldn't do it for $1 billion. It's just giving up your life. You're just giving up the majority of your life. What's the point? So you can be 65 and have a bitchin' boat? No, I'd rather have my 38 years of freedom, thank you very much. I'd rather have a family and a career and a life. There is no amount of money that makes this just. I wouldn't do it for $1 billion. Genuinely wouldn't do it for I wouldn't do it for 100 billion. And I don't think a lot of people would. If it was up to me, I'd happily give him a couple of billion quid, a luxury mega yacht, and pretty much anything else he wanted. In fact, blow it, let's go mad and throw in a casual criminalist notebook. But would even that be worthy compensation? The 2.5-year wait for an outcome that may not be successful just seems to be the latest hurdle in an arduous journey for Peter Sullivan, who continues to be let down on every conceivable level. Labour MP Kim Johnson has allegedly called for an inquiry into the case, highlighting the deep systematic failures in the UK's justice system and the need for a root and branch reform of the Criminal Cases Review Commission. That's not to mention an investigation into how Merseyside police handled the original case, a retooling of parole board procedures, and maybe a look at overhauling the government's compensation scheme to create a system which doesn't put the burden of proof on an innocent victim. Is there a Peter Sullivan GoFundMe? I feel a donation coming on. Help me get my website up. To start my own business, that's a different guy. Legendary producer. Send Peter to Taiwan and East Asia. How about we actually focus on this Peter, why is this not here? Why doesn't he have... What's going on? There's no indication yet of whether an inquiry might actually take place, as these are the only words we've heard from the government so far on the matter. Quote, "It's clear that Peter Sullivan has suffered a grave miscarriage of justice. We must carefully consider this judgment and look at how this could have happened and then get both him and Diane's family the answers they deserve." Wow, that's a whole lot of saying nothing, isn't it? Maybe we just need Elon Musk to tweet about it. A small black No, don't do that, Elon Musk, because then people will just hate on Peter Sullivan because they hate Elon Musk. A small black granite memorial stone can be found in Birkenhead, close to where the body of Diane Sindall was discovered on the 2nd of August 1986. It contains a surprisingly provocative inscription. Diane Sindall, murdered 2nd of the 8th, 1986, because she was a woman. In memory of all our sisters who have been R-worded and murdered, we will never let it be forgotten. Whew. Fresh flowers are still frequently laid next to the memorial stone today. Without a doubt, Diane Sindall was the biggest victim in this ghastly story, as her life was horrendously cut short at the age of 21, only a year before she planned to marry her partner and begin a whole new chapter. As the memorial stone suggests, this will never be forgotten. Yes, I agree, of course, because she lost her life at a very young age in a horrific way. But, unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about that. That has happened. That is the past. Peter Sullivan, on the other hand, he's chasing down a maximum of £1 million. I don't even know what to make of this. But the case spawned so many other victims alongside Diane. After all this time of grieving, the surviving members of Diane's family now have to deal with the raw pain of the revelation that the real murderer has never been caught, and Peter Sullivan was clearly an unwitting victim of the events of that night too. His only consolation after spending the majority of his life in prison is that the 68-year-old is now free to spend the rest of his life at home with his family. We don't know for certain what these family arrangements might involve, as the details are being kept largely private. Presumably Sullivan's parents, who always believed their son was innocent, have long since passed and didn't live to see the day that Sullivan was exonerated. Would they have long since passed? I don't know. My grandparents died a couple of years ago. My parents are, late 60s. I don't know if Peter's child may be involved in these arrangements. They would now be pushing 50, and unless they were somehow shielded from the drama, they may possibly have spent the vast majority of their life under the mistaken impression that their dad was a monster. Oh, I don't like that. We do know that Sullivan had siblings, Kim and David, who will hopefully be helping to take care of Sullivan in the future and help him navigate life outside of prison. When the conviction was finally quashed, David suggested that one of the first things they would do when the family got back together was have a game of darts, as everyone in the family loves a good session. I'm not entirely sure that Sullivan would have appreciated that, as he was grumpily losing at darts on the very same night that led to the loss of his freedom. I just hope that they didn't play the game at the Crown Hotel in Birkenhead, and it might have been a plan to let Sullivan win a few games, and to make sure nobody borrowed a crowbar at any point during the match. And if Peter Sullivan ever needed to go for a slash, I hope there was someone to guide him to an inside toilet. Otherwise, you never know what might happen. I don't know. I don't like this episode. This episode made me quite angry. This is a real massive cup that ruined someone's life. F*** that. Thanks for watching or listening. Yeah.